folks, welcome back to our recorded lectures for HI121. This is Barbarians in the North, the Celts and the Mediterranean world. So the Celts, somewhat like the Phoenicians, cannot be seen clearly due to problems with sources, the lack of sources except those written about them, also because of challenging archaeology. There is the question, very much like the Phoenicians, should we even be calling them the Celts, since that is not a name they gave themselves? Add to that, there are a lot of pieces of modern baggage that need to be unpacked as well. Now, although we cannot see these peoples clearly, it's important to try. They were actually a significant military force in the classical period, and it's important to understand the impact they had on events. They are partially in, partially out of history, in a way. We see them where they intersect with the Mediterranean world, but not in any sort of objective way. Clearly we do see them in a subjective way. And the big reason for this is that they are quote-unquote barbarians, with all that entails from the classical viewpoint. So let's see if we can't do them a little bit more justice, shall we? Alright, so before we get into that, we do have to tackle our own perspective on the Celts. So there is this fondness in the modern age for all things Celtic. So art, music, magic cannot help but affect our perception of who and what the Celts were. I am not saying it's bad to listen to neo-Celtic music or wear Celtic-inspired jewelry. I've been known to do both myself. But it's important not to assume that a taste for modern Celtic whatever tells you anything about the ancient peoples. And probably the best example of where this can go wrong is the sort of New Age approach to the Celts, so Celtic tarot and the like. I want to make it clear I am not being negative about Celtic neo-paganism here. Neo-paganism is a perfectly valid religious movement, but it also knows itself for what it is. It is not historical. It is inspired by history. It is not a perfect reflection of what the actual peoples of the time believed, because we simply don't have access to that information. Now, another issue is that Celtic heritage, please note the scare quotes, can be used as a rallying cry for nationalism. So the people of Brittany against the French state in the 19th century. This has a rather nasty habit of causing some marked biases in historical work. For instance, one must be very careful when reading Scottish stuff written about the English. This can also become very extreme, obviously. Celtic heritage is something that is co-opted, rather like Viking heritage, by far-right types as well. For instance, it's a bit tricky to wear a Celtic cross anywhere that people can see you wearing it these days, because very often a Celtic cross is used as a substitute for the swastika by the extreme right. So it's a bit sad. I have all of this lovely jewelry that I can no longer wear in public as a result. But I think what I'm trying to get at here is that the concept of Celticness can be all things to all people. It's sort of a shared historical fantasy that can be repurposed in many different areas of culture. And all of this shapes our perspective on the historical Celts. And this is hard because, setting all that aside even, understanding these people is tremendously difficult. It means trying to interpret a very wide variety of material culture, plus the classical sources, plus the vernacular literature of the British Isles, which would have begun as oral literature and which was only written down much later through a Christian lens. So I want to give you a little bit of archaeological background just to introduce the Celts from that viewpoint. It's a little more objective than the classical sources we're going to be talking about. When I say a little, I mean a lot. Celts are generally seen by archaeologists as the descendant of the Bell Beaker and other Bronze Age cultures. In the late Bronze Age, there are several cultural phenomena that are seen as marking the emergence of a pan-Celtic identity. Archaeologically speaking, this is seen to come in three phases. So their move from simple burial to cremation and burial of ashes in urns gave the first of these three phases the name urnfield culture. And this comes associated with specific types of houses, pottery, tools, and weapons. Around 1100 BC, we see the increase in fortification that leads to hilltop forts. That says something about the nature of the society and likely the emergence of a military leadership group. Around 1800 BCE, Hallstatt culture spreads north of the Alps, and this is named after a cemetery in Austria that yielded over 1,000 prehistoric graves. And here we see a distinct artistic style in the artifacts, a shift back towards burial, although cremation does continue. These two practices are not mutually exclusive. Now, small digression. Have you guys ever noticed how many times in movies set in the pre-modern period you see funeral scenes where cremation is taking place, even in cultures which may not actually have practiced cremation? At some point, I'm going to write an article about the depiction of cremation in popular culture, depicting the ancient and the medieval periods. It says something interesting. I'm just not sure what yet. Now, there are different zones within this cemetery as well. In the western zone, the elites are buried with swords. In the eastern zone, they're buried with axes. And in the west, they also are buried with chariots, which is interesting. Now, the third phase is the Latene culture, which dates from about 450 BCE to the Roman period. And this is where we see the typical spiral and interlace art that we also see reflected in modern Neo-Celtic art. So things like torques, which are the thick gold necklaces or bracelets, animal and vegetal forms. We see oppida, which are fortified towns, ritual shaft graves, the cult of the severed head. Okay, so yeah, the Celts were big on taking heads, because this was assumed to be sort of the seat of your enemy's soul and understanding. Now, these art styles survive well past the Roman conquest, particularly in the British Isles, where you see them combined with later Saxon styles to create a distinct insular style. This is all very much shorthand too, guys. You got to keep that in mind. No one is making an argument here that these groups are ethnic groups, and that is something that needs to be remembered very clearly. They are groups that demonstrate shared cultural traits. It may be many different groups within the material culture. You never know why people adopt aspects of material culture. I know this is something we've talked about before. So, the idea of, are there Celts out there? Do we call them Celts? That's a legitimate question. And we're sticking to the shorthand just simply because, it is reflected in the classical sources we're going to be looking at, but you need to know that it is shorthand. So here we get to the fun stuff. There is nothing that is simultaneously more frustrating and more fun than trying to understand a so-called barbarian group from the perspective of Greek and Roman sources. I taught a course once called The Barbarian Invasions, and it was all about trying to read between the lines. So what do we have about the Celts from the ancient perspective? Not a lot of substance until much later, to be honest. There is a fragment from a 4th century BCE Greek history that survives in Strabo's geography. This is from 3 centuries later, and it says that Celts inhabit the region from which the west wind blows. It's very poetic, but not very helpful. It's basically a way of saying they're off in uncharted territory. Celtica is seen as very large by Greek geographers. Other fragments say they lived beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which is the Straits of Gibraltar. Others say that the Danube arose in the land of the Celts. I think you're probably seeing the problem here. Different locations, very different locations, which of course makes sense because this is not a single unified people that lived in a single location, but trying to track where they all came from and why they were there is nearly impossible. Well, probably pretty much impossible. Now, we do know that certain key sites existed. A city called Narbonne which is related to the modern city of Narbonne, which was a Celtic trading city. Massalia, which is Marseille. It's a Greek city founded near Celtic territory. And again, the Greeks were likely lumping together many different barbarian groups as Celts or Keltoi. There was really no reason for them to understand the geography of more remote areas of Europe. Why would they? Only the frontier zones are within their area of interest. Now, Caesar has an interesting comment. He says that the Romans call the Gauls, or the Galli, or Galatai, but in their own language, they're called the Celts. Is he right? Hard to say. Other sources say, oh no, these terms are completely interchangeable. What we can conclude is that there were peoples from about the 6th century onwards, BCE onwards, who were known as Galli or as Celts by the Greek world. Galli or Galatai could also translate as stranger or enemy, which means it might be a general purpose name for northern barbarians, so we don't know if all the Galli were actually Celts. It's less that classical authors are being sloppy than they're reflecting probably this very changeable situation where different tribes would come together in confederations that would then shift and take on different names and break up and recoalesce into new forms. So it's not so much ethnic confusion as confusion due to an effort by our classical writers to impose a single ethnicity where the situation is actually a lot more complex. Now, in any case, the Mediterranean world doesn't have direct contact with the Celts in great quantities until the 4th century BCE, where they would have been encountered first as migrants, raiders, and mercenaries. They were clearly seen as barbarians, so they were caricatured in classical writing as being warlike, being courageous, sometimes to the point of insanity, often being quite drunk. So they're vain, they're brave, but they're childlike. Now, there are a few interesting comments that are made. Aristotle says that homosexuality was perfectly acceptable amongst the Celts. He also claims that they toughened up their children by dunking babies in cold rivers and underdressing them. He says they punished any young man who became fat enough for his stomach to hang over his belt. And he commented upon their mustaches. He said they have long, drooping mustaches, so long that drink is actually strained through them. This may be an exaggerated reflection of actual behavior patterns. Greeks in particular were fascinated by barbarian facial hair. Now, after encounters with the Celts in the 4th and the 3rd centuries, so there's an additional twist that gets added to the depiction of them as fearless warriors from the north. This is the idea that they tested the Greeks, they made them greater. The civilized world triumphed over the barbarian. They were a worthy foe, but the Greeks were better than them. Now, the Romans, on the other hand, were a lot more hostile, for reasons that we'll discuss shortly. There is one author worth mentioning in particular. This is Posidonius, a Syrian Greek who traveled widely in Europe to collect information for his history writing. He created an ethnography of the Celts that's used by many later writers. He depicted them as noble savages living in a golden age that Rome had left behind. Now, classical ethnographers really liked using barbarian peoples as a way of pointing out how corrupt the civilized world had become. So there's a lot of different ways in which the Celts are approached by classical writers, and it gives this very ambiguous and fractured image of them. Possibly the best thing to do is to take a look at some specifics now, so that we can kind of nail down some of the details. Now, they burst onto the scene and into the historical record with a bang, as is usual for barbarian groups. We know that various Celtic tribes were in conflict with the Etruscans in the Po River Valley in the 6th century. There are no contemporary sources for this, just retrospective discussions. So, for instance, it's referred to in sources that talk about a confederation that defeats the Etruscans in a battle near the river Ticino in 475 BCE. Now, again, we do see a certain complexity in social structure here. Whenever ancient historians start talking about confederations of peoples, that's shorthand for we know it was actually very complicated, but we're not sure how. Now, by the beginning of the 4th century, most Etruscan territory north of the Apennines was in Celtic hands, and this is finalized by a great battle at Melpum in 396 BCE. All right, so here's where things get really interesting. In 390 BCE, the Senones, which is a tribe led by a figure known as Brennus, show up outside the Etruscan city of Clusium. They ask to be allowed to settle on Etruscan land in peace. This is interesting. Why did they want to resettle? Was there something going on back in their traditional territory? They needed to move, maybe political changes, maybe environmental factors. Roman writers had multiple explanations, some of which may be just shots in the dark. It's hard to say. Now, the Etruscans, who had been conquered by Rome, asked Rome for ambassadors to help them negotiate. And for some reason, the ambassadors decided to ignore what's called the customary law of nations. So at the time, the customary law of nations said that when you agree to negotiate, you need to do it. But instead of doing that, they wound up joining with the Etruscans to fight Brennus and his people. Again, the chain of events is not clear because there are multiple different accounts. We're told that Brennus demanded reparations for this breach in manners, but Rome ignored him. So Brennus marched on Rome, defeated them at the Battle of the Allia in 390, then moved on to Rome itself, where the senators and the military leaders shut themselves up on the Capitoline Hill, and Brennus and his Celts hung around pillaging and attempting to take the hill until the Senate paid a tribute. This was likely a mutual decision on both sides. There's only so much time an army can hang around part of Rome before they need to basically go home and find something to eat. The Senate, of course, would not have wanted to be penned up for any longer than necessary. So we think it was a tribute in gold. One source says 100, one source says 1,000. In other words, we don't really know. Now, one of the more amusing anecdotes from this whole set of events comes from an account of when the tribute was being weighed. And supposedly a Roman officer complains that the Celts shouldn't use their own weights. And Brennus supposedly flings his sword on the scales and shouts "Vae victis," which means woe to the vanquished. Or in other words, the conqueror dictates the terms. All right, so here's the thing about the Battle of the Allia and the aftermath. It doesn't really matter what actually happened. It doesn't. Because what matters is what the Roman tradition decided happened. And what was decided was that they were humiliated by these events. They had been defeated by this barbarian enemy. This was not okay. This was incredibly traumatic to them. They were occupied. The impact matters, not the details. Roman historians hated this piece of their history. So what they did is they kept depicting the Celts as drunken, childlike barbarians. They depicted the anniversary day of the battle, July the 18th, as a day of ill omen forever afterwards. Now, it still took the Romans some time to conquer these Celtic groups on the Italian peninsula. The other Latin city-states which were resisting Rome welcomed them as mercenaries in their armies. Plutarch says there was another battle between them at the river Anio, and that the Romans greatly feared the Celts. There is a law from this 4th century period which says that priests are exempt from military service, except, quote, in the case of another Celtic war. 376 BCE, there was another Celtic army at the gates of Rome. 361, another. And apparently the Celts loved to solve matters by single combat. They would send out a champion and say, "Send us yours, let's do it." And this was seen as a problem by the Romans. So a couple of decades after this, the consul specifically forbids Roman commanders to engage in single combat with Celts. Now, there was a treaty with the Senones in 344 BCE, but the Romans never stopped fearing an invasion from the north. Even the rumor of a Celtic army could cause them to send out the troops. They were neurotic about it, and this is why they hated the Celts so much. Now, Celtic expansion did continue, and our sources tell us when the armies withdrew from Rome, they would go south, not north, because they had connections with the Greek city-states of southern Italy. And meanwhile, in the north, they're attempting to expand into the Danube Valley towards the Black Sea, into the Crimea. Now, in 335 or perhaps 434, we're told that Alexander the Great met with Celtic chiefs on the banks of the Danube and came to an agreement with them that they would not attack his northern frontiers while he's off in the east. So this is one of those points in history I'd have loved to be a fly on the wall, just to see what actually happened. There is a suggestion that they went to pay homage to him, but other scholars say, no, that's an excuse. What they did is they went to assess the Macedonian military. So it's not hard to imagine, very effective military leaders showing up, seeing Alexander the Great's army and going, yeah, no, this is not someone we want to push. Alexander was sort of in a class all his own. So they agreed they did not test his northern boundaries while he was gone. All right, back to Rome. In the end, the Romans do manage to defeat the Senones decisively, and they basically ethnically cleansed their entire territory as a warning to the other Celtic groups in the north. The most important thing to remember here, however, is that this was hard for Rome. They couldn't simply end the threat. There were numerous battles, numerous Roman defeats over the course of decades. Pardon me. They're not dealing with primitive tribesmen. They're dealing with groups that are a real threat to them. These Celtic groups are a military power. They're not a barbarian horde. All right, moving on. Sorry, that title should be the Celts in the 3rd century, not the 4th century. So in the 3rd century, we do see a massive military undertaking after Alexander's death by the eastern tribes. And they show up in 279 BCE on the northern border of Macedonia. The first group, there are 3 divisions of Celtic troops. The first group kills the king of Macedon, Ptolemy Ceranos, who had been one of Alexander's generals. The second, which was commanded by a second Brennus, that name is not good luck for the Greeks and the Romans, moved into Greece through Macedonia, defeated an Athenian army at another battle of Thermopylae. Interesting, there are many different battles of Thermopylae. I don't know if you guys knew that, including a few that didn't necessarily need to happen there, but which did because one commander or another was sort of entranced by the story of Leonidas. Brennus's group went through the mountains and sacked Delphi. Greeks were very traumatized by this. They canceled the games because clearly the gods were angry. Now, Greek tradition says that Brennus committed suicide in shame at having sacked Delphi. Nonsense. As far as we can tell, he just withdrew and didn't suffer any kind of military defeat at all. The Greeks were wanting to make themselves look better in this defeat, so you can't really take their account at face value. Remember, they saw the Celts as barbarians too. They're not as vindictive as the Romans, but this is a cause for shame for them, that they were so badly defeated and that their most sacred site was sacked. So the 3rd Celtic division occupied eastern Macedonia, but was eventually defeated by the new king, Gonatas. He couldn't drive them all the way out, however. So if you can't get rid of them, why not use them? I mean, it's a far more sensible way to approach the problem. It preserves resources on both sides. So he arranges for the survivors to be hired on as mercenaries by himself and other Greek kings. King Nicomedes of Bithynia invited 20,000 of them with their families to cross into Asia Minor. And there they established a state that they called Galatia. We're told that they provided very effective military service to Nicomedes. Now, the Greeks actually called this the Commonwealth of Galatia. Now, unsurprisingly, however, the Celts tended not to be really great neighbors. They raided a lot, and likely just kind of ruled as a sort of military aristocracy over the existing inhabitants. Their position there was weakened after a few decades because they picked the wrong ally, and the king forced them to stay at home and behave themselves. They were still in demand as mercenaries, however, so they're never displaced per se. Now, about 4,000 of the Celts from Macedonia were invited to go to Egypt and serve the Ptolemies there, and more seems to have followed. In 217 BCE, at the Battle of Raphia, there were 14,000 Celts, we're told, in the army of Ptolemy IV as he fought the king of Syria. And the Egyptian sources tell us that they won in large part because of the Celtic cavalry. And our non-historical evidence for this, our archaeological evidence, is shockingly good. There is a Celtic cemetery that was found just southeast of Alexandria. There's even Celtic graffiti in the Chapel of Horus at the Temple of Karnak. Now, at one point, we know that Celtic troops rose up briefly against the pharaoh and were killed. Coins were minted with Celtic symbols on it to commemorate the Egyptian victory. But they still brought in more Celtic mercenaries. After all, just because some Celts behave badly doesn't mean they're all going to do that, and they are very good at what they do. Now, even the most famous of our Cleopatras had a personal bodyguard of 300 Celts. And when Augustus defeated her, he said, okay, you guys go and serve King Herod in Judea. And in the sources that talk about Herod's funeral, they, or rather their descendants most likely, are recorded as having been there. Now, despite the success of certain Celtic groups as mercenaries, however, the conflict with Rome continued. In 225, we see a Celtic army defeat a Roman army at the Battle of Clusium in 225. It is one victory, and they are eventually defeated themselves. Rome started to conduct military campaigns across the Apennines into the northern part of Celtic territory, and they started winning and setting up military garrisons. Now, in Spain, we also have Celtic groups, and they had been resisting Carthage. They actually assassinated the original Carthaginian general who had conquered those Spanish territories, the one who set up his capital, Cartagena, which is New Carthage. But when Hannibal rose to power, he decided to try and make friends. After all, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. He wins their support. And they are why he is able to pass over the Alps into Italy, because his army was accompanied by tens of thousands of Celts. They also helped Carthage defend itself against Rome during the Punic Wars. They were at the Battle of Utica in 203 BCE. They were at the Battle of Zama and fought against Scipio. Now, after Carthage was defeated, the Romans turned their attention back to this northern campaign. And even then, it took 10 more years to conquer the Po Valley. They realized they were going to have to Romanize these peoples if they were going to hold the territory. Now, I'll stop there, since we're out of the 3rd century. But obviously, there are major conflicts with Celtic groups elsewhere, in Iberia, in Gaul. This was not a string of endless Roman victories. These are hard, brutal wars, where Rome had to use absolutely merciless tactics to win. So what do we take away from this? Basically, the Celts are not peripheral people who are only important in the British Isles. They were deeply involved in the politics and wars of the Mediterranean. They were a force to be reckoned with. We have to look past the classical caricature of the Celts as crazy, drunken, barbarian warriors to try and reconstruct the historical reality. Now, only by doing that can we broaden what's traditionally a very narrow view of what was going on in the Mediterranean world. As always, frontiers are tremendously important places. Key things happen there. All right, so that is the end of that lecture. And apologies for my voice going, but apparently I needed a glass of water to finish this off. I hope it's still audible. And I will see you guys next week.